don't know how to handicap the likelihood of it. I would say this. There's a school of thought that Biden's pardon of his son was partially based in affection for his son, but partially based in ongoing resentment since July toward the Democratic Party. This is something he did with some animus to them. And I could see if he doesn't grant the pardons, I could see his animus about potentially feeling like he'd been pushed aside being a reason to keep him from doing it. If he didn't do it, I could see the tremendously harsh criticism that he received for this pardon of his son being a reason not to do it. If he does it, I think it would be in his hopes that he would be remembered for granting mass pardons, not just for that one. So I think there's substantive reasons to do it. He's enough of a believer in the judicial system that I think he might hesitate. But if this would make Hunter Biden a footnote rather than a headline, I see the additional incentive for him.
Yeah.
All of which is to say, Scott, I have no idea. Melissa, can you ask me an easier question, please?
Hi, Dan. I was just thinking, kind of based on Carol's question, just a different way of looking at it. What do you think about the calculus of Iran getting closer to nukes and how that might affect its relationship vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia or others? Because I feel like that's a hot potato.
I think you're right. And I brought that up briefly in the webinar, but I ended up rushing past it just because I was conscious of the time. I do feel like there are two paths available to Iran right now, given how exposed and how vulnerable it is. One is to try to secure itself diplomatically, but the other, and I honestly do think more likely, is that they try to secure themselves militarily and saying, if our conventional military capability cannot protect us, if Hamas's and Hezbollah's and Lebanon's and Syria's conventional military capability cannot protect us, maybe we really do need to move toward nuclear weapons. I don't think that moving toward nuclear weapons and moving closer to Saudi Arabia are mutually exclusive, but I think it'd be hard to do both simultaneously. I think if nothing else, I think China would not want to be part and parcel of that. And I think, and we know that Trump believes very strongly that harsher economic sanctions against Iran are needed in order to prevent them from pursuing nukes more quickly. And so the question is someone like a Marco Rubio or a Mike Waltz able to convince the president-elect that doing the opposite, saying we will actually lessen some of these sanctions in exchange for you stepping back from pursuing nuclear weapons. I think the harsher sanctions are more likely. It's what he did in 2017, and I think it's what he's disposed to do now. And the question about whether that makes it harder for Iran to move toward nuclear weapons or easier, I don't know the answer to that. And the reason I don't know the answer to that, I will tell you, I'll admit to you, my original draft for the webinar today included a whole section on an Iranian populist uprising, the types of which we saw with the Green Resolution, the type of which we saw a couple of years ago in the aftermath of Syria. And I finally realized that the World Affairs Council town hall get really mad if I did a 3-hour webinar tonight, so I cut it out. I think what will more than anything will determine whether Iran moves closer to nuclear weapons or away from them depends on whether they believe that their domestic political situation is secure or not. Because if I believe the young woman had taken off her hijab in Tehran at the height of a Syrian uprising, I suspect you'd have seen a much different type of outcome in Iran. And I think if the Iranian Green Revolution from several years ago had taken place simultaneously with the Syrian revolution, it would have been much more harder for the mullahs to keep things under control. So ultimately, I think Iran's domestic politics probably determines whether they move closer or further from nuclear weapons. And for the record, that was not easier than Scott's question. God.
You, Dan.
Anyone else like to weigh in? Wow, this is a record. I've drilled you people into submission. God.
Roger's waiting patiently.
I'm sorry?
Roger is waiting
Oh, I'm
patiently.
sorry, Roger. I didn't see your hand go up. I was just thinking to myself, he's being uncharacteristically quiet tonight.
There you go. Yeah, mine's sort of related to that too. Given the ethics issues aside, with the cabinet positions, how important is it for them to have expertise? And do you think they'll take the counsel, especially on these international issues, from the underlings who really do have the deep understanding of what's going on in there? Does that make sense?
Actually, you cut out for just a moment at the beginning of the question, Roger, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, yeah, the ethics issues aside on these cabinet appointments, how important, and since I don't think a lot of them have expertise in the jobs they're getting appointed to, what's the likelihood that they'll take the advice and the counsel from the underlings who really do have the expertise?
So that's what I thought. That's where I thought you were going, and I'm glad I asked you to clarify it. It's pretty clear. There's two types of presidential administrations in our country. There's strong cabinets, and there's White House, or alternatively White House centric decision-making processes. And it's pretty clear that Trump is internalizing a lot of the decision-making authority in the White House and not in the cabinet agencies. Your instinct is the right one. Keeping an eye on who the undersecretaries and deputy secretaries are is important for two reasons. One, for their policy expertise, but second, because of their history with Trump. What smart presidents of both parties have done in the past is they've appointed very visible political figures to high-profile cabinet positions and then appointed deputies right under them to keep an eye on them. Given that, I think what we'd all agree is the primary lesson that Trump learned in his first term, which is he needs advisors who are loyal to him. We're not going to have any more Mattises or McMasters around him. I think to the extent that there are members of his cabinet who aren't invested loyalists, they'll be surrounded at their agencies by people who are. As far as the policy expertise, I suspect from everything I know about Susie Wiles is that policy expertise will be concentrated more on the White House staff than in the cabinet agencies themselves. What I would say, just to add to this, since we're on the topic of Trump's cabinet appointees, I would suggest that we divide his appointees to date into three categories. There are revolutionaries, there are reassurers, and there are loyalists. Now, for the reasons I just said, they're all loyalists to some degree or another. He learned his lesson in 2017 on that front. But there's a certain number of cabinet members, Gabbard, Hepseth, Patel, Kennedy, who are revolutionaries. Their job is to go into their respective agencies and disrupt, and to fundamentally alter the way that those aspects of government are overseen and conducted. The reassurers are people like Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz on the foreign policy front, people like Scott Bessent, and to a slightly lesser extent Wiccan on the economic front. This is Trump attempting to send reassuring signals, whether to Wall Street or the international markets or to international leaders, saying, hey, it's okay. I've got people around me who know what they're doing. And on any number of different decisions, the last person he listens to, either a revolutionary or a reassurer, is going to determine policy trajectory. And he's very consciously set up his cabinet with both. Carol asks a really smart question. Why has J.D. Vance essentially disappeared? And it's because J.D. Vance has figured out very, very quickly that being on television is not the most important part of being vice president. And apparently Vance is spending an extraordinary amount of time doing two things right now. Number one, he is working to get his own allies appointed throughout the administration, both in the White House and the old executive office building itself, but also in the cabinet agencies. He wants to have a network of his own in the administration. And second, he's working Capitol Hill really, really hard on behalf of Trump's nominees. And I think what Vance has decided, or someone advising him has decided correctly, is that high visibility isn't in his own personal best interest right now, but establishing a base of influence is a better use of his time. Carol.
Yes, I wonder what are the scenarios of what kind of a relationship will be between Syria and Lebanon.
Well, at this point, for all practical purposes, neither country exists. You know, Lebanon, depending on how Israel conducts itself in the weeks and months ahead. You know, Lebanon has essentially been just a staging ground for Hezbollah for as long, for many years now. And given Hezbollah's weakness, it's an open question on whether Lebanon can now establish a legitimate operating government. But at least right now, they don't have one. And Syria, as of this weekend, not either. So I think for all practical purposes, there's not much of a relationship between the two. And if there were, I'm not sure how much of a difference it would make. The other big difference, though, about with Syria's change that we didn't talk about in the webinar and hasn't come up here yet, is what it means for Hezbollah. Because for years, Iran has used Syria, just geographically, if you look up at a map of the Middle East, Syria is the highway that Iran uses to get arms and weapons to Hezbollah. And now they can't do that anymore. So it doesn't mean that they can't get weapons to Hezbollah. It just means it's going to be a lot harder. And with both Iran and Hezbollah in a weakened state, and with Israel becoming more and more assertive, now we're seeing that in Syria as well, I think it becomes much harder for Hezbollah to reconstitute itself. Because again, whatever emerges in Syria is certainly going to be no friend of Iran's. It's wild. I think we all know, being part of an organization like this one, that nothing in the world happens in a vacuum. You know, the whole butterfly wing theory. The butterfly flutters its wings, and 1,000 miles away, something extraordinary happens as a result of the chain events. But I feel like that's particularly notable now, because if you do think this through, Assyria to Iran to Saudi Arabia to Israel to Palestinians set of influences, it really does become extremely stark, at least to me, how intricately interrelated this all is, and how difficult it is even for the most experienced diplomats to try to address a problem. You know, think of it as like geopolitical pickup sticks. You know how you take one stick out and you try to do it without knocking all the other ones over. I have a great respect for the professional diplomatic corps. And Scott, before I come to you, it's going to sound like an improbable segue, but only because it is. Speaking of professional diplomatic corps, it got no attention today whatsoever. But after it was rumored over the last few days that Trump was considering appointing the almost governor of Arizona, Lake, to be his ambassador to Mexico, he instead appointed a career diplomat. I have to admit, I was alarmed when I saw the headline. It said Ron Johnson becomes ambassador to Mexico. And I thought, oh my gosh, he appointed the senator from Wisconsin to be ambassador to Mexico. What's that about? But apparently, and I didn't know this, I have to admit, there's another Ron Johnson who was the ambassador to El Salvador during Trump's first term, and had served in the CIA in Latin America for many years before that. And the fact that he has become ambassador to Mexico means that someone, whether it's Trump or Rubio or someone else high in the administration, has realized that's not a place for a donor or a show horse. That the fact that they're putting a professional there, I think, is a very reassuring sign. Scott, I'm taking you are not going to ask me about either Ron Johnson. Is that fair?
Correct. So my question, I'm back to domestic again, which you kind of have gone to. You think that Trump will lose one more nominee. Which one? And secondly, who do you think the Republican senators are that are going to do this?
Can I answer the second question and pretend you didn't ask the first one? Look,
No.
I don't know who the other one is. I guess my point is there might be one or two, but there is neither going to be a wholesale disapproval. That's not going to happen. And I don't think that all of them are going to get through because you do have a small number of senators. And this is why I think your second question, jokes aside, is the really important one. There's a small number of senators who do want to push back at the right opportunity. And let's assume that for those one or two nominees, that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are two of them. Both of them can get reelected without Donald Trump. And in fact, the reelections are probably improved with his opposition. The third, at least on an international relations matter, is Mitch McConnell. McConnell, I'll say this as politely as I can. I'll keep this in mind as you're hearing from someone who spends a lot of time on a college campus. Mitch McConnell appears to have senioritis. He's ready to graduate. It's his last term. He's ready to finish up, and he can do what he wants. And he has made it very clear and very seriously that his greatest concern now is the growing isolationism in our country, in both the Republican and the Democratic Party. And so I will not be surprised at all to see him as a no vote on at least one, if not more, of Trump's foreign policy nominees. After that, I think you can look at Bill Cassidy, the senator from Louisiana. It's worth remembering that Cassidy is the only other sitting senator other than Collins and Murkowski who voted for Trump's impeachment back in 2021. Todd Young from Indiana very specifically and publicly did not endorse Trump for re-election. He did not endorse Harris. I think he said he was voting for Ronald Reagan or Theodore Roosevelt or someone, but he felt it necessary to let the people of his state know he was not voting for Trump. John Curtis, the new senator from Utah, appears to be very much of a Romney Republican as opposed to a MAGA Republican. Tom Tillis from North Carolina is another possibility. There's probably about 7 or 8 Republicans who, under the right circumstances, could vote no. And I think getting 4 or 5 of those for 1 or 2 nominees is probable, but not for much more than that.
Hey, Dan, can I ask you kind of a related question, which is there was so much talk right after the election about Trump trying to use recess appointments. And everyone was talking about the Supreme Court case and Scalia's concurrence from years ago when the issue of the recess appointment clause came before the Supreme Court. And it seems to have died away. I just don't hear as much of that anymore. Do you think that's still in play for that to be a possible tool that he tries to use?
Look, as you know, Larry, Trump has a very expansive view of executive authority. So I don't think it's ever gone. And I think it's less likely to be done on a sweeping basis for 2 reasons. One, because I think Trump and the people around him have realized he's going to get most of his nominees without doing that. And, if the trade-off is Tulsi Gabbard, it's probably not, that might not be the hill he wants to die on. And I think the other thing to keep in mind, and as they begin to talk more and more seriously about budget and border and other reconciliation issues this year, I think Trump and the people around him recognize that they need those senators. And if they offend them unnecessarily on appointments, it's going to be that much harder to bring them along. Right now, the Senate appears to be much closer to Trump on the timeline for moving legislation than the House is. The Senate, as I think most of you have seen, have made it clear that they think that moving on border and security issues and energy issues first makes more sense, and then coming back to taxes some months down the line. The House is much more restive about that. But I think Trump doesn't have a very close relationship with John Thune, but I think a Senate without Mitch McConnell as the Republican leader, think it's like a new toy for Trump, and I think he just wants to play with it for a while and see how it works.
Fair enough.
Anybody else have any other questions? Yeah, Melissa.
I'm just getting in there on a point. Any insight on the new ambassador to Greece?
I will say this. I lived in San Francisco for several years, back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I will say that I remember attending a cocktail party one night in which Parks Commissioner Gavin Newsom, Deputy District Attorney Kamala Harris, and Mrs. Newsom, also known as Kimberly Guilfoyle, were all at the same reception. And if you had told me in 1998 that this is where they would all be 16 years later, I'm not sure I would have believed you. What's interesting about Guilfoyle, and I hesitate to engage in personal gossip. Okay, not that much. But as you may have read, her relationship with Donald Trump Jr. appears to be over. And it occurred to me that by appointing her, first of all, Guilfoyle has raised did raise a ton of money for the Trump campaign. She was a valuable surrogate. So even absent her relationship with Donald Jr., she was, someone in Trump's orbit, by very much of a loyalist. But I could certainly imagine the president-elect deciding to make it a little bit easier for his son to pursue his new relationship by sending his former partner to Greece.
Thanks, Dan.
As you might guess, that's guesswork also. Okay, so guys, this conversation has now devolved to a level lower than we've ever done over the course of the last 4.5 years.
Well, that's because of who got elected.
I think the rest of us deserve some
fun.
responsibility for this. But listen, as always, thank you so much. And as always, as you know, as much as I enjoy the webinar, this time with you guys is by far my favorite part of the program. So thank you for being here, and I will look forward to seeing you for our pre-inaugural edition in January. In the meantime, I hope you all enjoy your holidays and have a very happy new year, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks so much.